Good morning, everyone, and good afternoon for those of us joining us from the US. Welcome to our 216 reimbursement update presented by Sarah Griffin from Medtechnique, that's me, and George Papdopoulos from Emerald Corporate Group. So just to start off, we'll have a little bit of housekeeping. So this is what you should probably see on your screen, and what you need to do is either choose whether you want to join by telephone or by the mic and speakers, and you can open and close your control panel. And if you want to submit a question or a comment, you can do that in the question section right here. Okay, well, we'll get started. If I can work the screen here. Great. So this is as I said, an update about the reimbursement environment in Australia for medical technology, including drugs and devices. So first of all, just to introduce ourselves, I'm Sarah Griffin. I run a consultancy in Sydney called Medtechnique Consulting, and I specialise in market access for medical technology, primarily devices and procedures. And George, do you want to introduce yourself, George?
Yes, good morning. It's George Papdopoulos, and I have a consultancy as well in Sydney. I'm partnering with Sarah, our company's Emerald Corporate Group, and I look forward to the webinar this morning.
Great. Okay, we'll get started. So first of all, I'm going to talk about the reimbursement environment for devices and procedures, and then George will talk about his speciality drugs, and then we'll have some time for questions at the end. Okay, so just setting the scene, particularly for those of us who don't live in Australia, I'll do a very brief overview of our system just so to have a bit of context. So we've got a universal healthcare system called Medicare, which covers all Australians for hospital care and subsidised outpatient services, but half of all Australians also opt to have private health insurance. Private health insurance is primarily hospital care and limited ancillary covers such as dental and physiotherapy, but it excludes primary care and pharmaceutical. Consequently, we have a bit of a weird mix of public and private systems, which at times, even though we have an excellent system overall, can be somewhat fragmented, and there's lots of diverse economic incentives at times. So, talking about private hospitals, which a lot of the regulation relates to be treated in a private hospital, you have to be treated have a procedure that's on the medical benefits schedule. The medical benefits schedule is a list of medical procedures that's subsidised by Medicare in private hospitals. The medical benefits schedule also covers outpatient procedures, and we'll talk a bit about it later. It's primarily a scheme that reimburses physicians and other healthcare professionals for performing the procedure. And the procedure must be included on the MBS to be covered by private health insurance. So we also have a weird little quirk in Australia called the prostheses list. This applies to private patients in private hospitals and at times public hospitals, but that's a bit complex, so we won't go into it at the moment. So basically, there's a list of devices that are implantable, hence the name prostheses, even though it's a bit of an anachronistic term. So it's primarily hips, pacemakers, grafts, etc., anything that stays in the body and in your body when you leave the hospital. And they receive a payment over and above any other payment that is received for that episode of care. So it's quite a valuable system for providers and for suppliers of medical technology, and it gives certainty to everyone involved in the provision of these devices. However, devices that are not implanted are at a distinct disadvantage. So examples of these would be cardiac catheters, radio frequency beacons, and a few other things like that. So, Australia 2016, just like Australia 2015, we did our last webinar, we're the land of health system reviews. There's been 7 health reviews in the last couple of years, but today I'm going to concentrate primarily on 2 of them, the private health insurance review and the medical benefits schedule review. because these are the ones that we're getting some results from. And also I'm going to talk at the end about some reforms to the Medical Services Advisory Committee process. Okay, the first thing, the private health insurance review. This was started in 2015 and held public consultations. It was quite ideologically led in that the questions were quite loaded as to what was asked of people who participated in the surveys and the consultation. But primarily the aim of the government was to enhance the value of private health insurance and to try and improve the efficiency of private health insurance. And also, since private health insurance is quite heavily subsidised in Australia through tax incentives, to improve the effectiveness of those incentives. And overall, to maintain and improve the sustainability of the private healthcare sector. But it's highly, highly political. And one of the most political aspects of the review was prostheses, as we've discussed before, because primarily health insurance, private health insurers want to pay less for prostheses, and they've run a pretty clever, well-targeted campaign that highlights the cost of prostheses in the private sector. So this was in the financial review last year. There's also been quite recently a whole lot of discussion basically blaming the increase in private health insurance premiums on prostheses. And I think the reason this is because prostheses is an area that the insurers feel that they may be able to exercise some area of control over, whereas it's a bit harder with things like salaries and wages of hospital employees, which is also what drives the cost of premiums. So it's been a very, very clever and very, very intensive campaign. So this quote was just a couple of weeks ago from the CEO of Private Healthcare Australia, which is the peak body for the private insurers. And this is it. Australian patients are paying between 2 and 5 times too much for prostheses or medical devices, such as hip and knee replacements, lens replacements. And this is directly influencing how high premiums are rising every year. Now, there's no doubt that the stats have been cherry-picked, but there is, you know, in all effective campaigns, there are certainly some very, you know, big elements of truth in this. So this has been playing in the media consistently. So it was very clear that the very first target of the private health review would be the prostheses list. And, you know, the government has been talking about this for some time. This is our Health Minister, Susan Ley, who is very dedicated to reform of the health system. And she's been calling for devices to be made more affordable and accessible. But it's also been seen as the primary driver of health insurance premiums, whereas in reality, prostheses only make up 14% of the payments that health funds pay out. So the industry was actually facing a 40% across-the-board cut to all devices, which was quite a blunt instrument, and there was some quite successful lobbying of the industry to the minister and other stakeholders that actually the prostheses market is far more complex than that, and that, you know, really wouldn't serve any real purpose and would be quite disruptive and damaging to patients and industry alike if such a blunt instrument was used, such as an across-the-board cut. So the minister's response to this was to form an industry working group, included industry, insurers, hospitals, doctors and consumers. And this must have been an interesting meeting to be at because some of the interests of these groups are diametrically opposed. However, they did come out with an outcome statement. What really wasn't an outcome statement in that they didn't agree on any steps, but it really came out with some agreed positions. So it was agreed there's lack of transparency in the current system and that there are scope for benefit reductions in some categories on the prostheses list. Also, recognition that there's significant cost in providing prostheses in Australia. Australia is a big country with a small population, and it can be quite, the cost of providing, shipping and providing clinical support can be very significant. And also the definition of a prosthesis, which is, you know, hopelessly old-fashioned. needs to be able to be flexible to allow for new technology to be covered as well. And also that the Prosthesis List Advisory Committee, the PLARC, should not refuse to list devices on the grounds of safety, because that assessment should be made by the Australian regulatory body, the Therapeutic Goods Association. So just last week, the Minister released the first reform, and it was reform of the Prosthesis List Advisory Committee. For those outside of Australia, this is the committee that decides the clinical and cost effectiveness and makes recommendations to the Minister on devices to be included on the prosthesis list. So we're not quite sure what this revamp's going to mean at the moment, but it's certainly that there's going to be a focus on cost and affordability immediately. And also on process, so we're not sure what's going to happen, but hopefully there'll be a bit more transparency in the assessment, which is hopelessly opaque at the moment and very frustrating for sponsors who get a rejection, and it's often quite hard to find out specifically why a device was rejected. And interestingly, the new chair is Professor Terry Campbell, who has been on the Pharmaceutical Benefits Advisory Committee. And why this is interesting is because the PBAC, the Pharmaceutical Benefits Advisory Committee, is quite a rigorous assessment body for drugs, and it can't be said that the Prosthesis List Advisory Committee exercises the same level of rigour. So I wouldn't be surprised if there's some quite big changes to the listing process, and it might be, might be much more demanding on sponsors. Okay, so the other thing I want to talk about is the medical benefits schedule review. Now, as you remember, I was talking earlier that the MBS, the medical benefits schedule, is a list of procedures that the Australian government will subsidise on the medical benefits under the Australian Medicare system. And when we say subsidise, it means they pay a fee to perform the procedure to physicians or other healthcare professionals. Oh, sorry, I just let forward a couple of slides there. So there's 5,700 items on the MBS, and the aim of the review was to update it because there's never really been a full root and branch review of the medical benefits schedule. So this review is supported by all sides of politics and the medical profession and most stakeholder groups. So the terms of reference is everything on the MBS, which is pretty comprehensive. The idea is to try and increase the value derived from the services, get rid of obsolete items, make sure that the items are safe, they're clinically necessary, they're based on evidence, appropriateness, and also to look at the legislation and rules that underpin the MBS, because often they're very complex and very hard to negotiate. So the interim report was released last week. It was very lengthy, and basically it was really a description of how the process was progressing rather than a lot of outcomes at this stage. But there were some quite interesting things in it. So they outlined a schedule for clinical committees. So there's a clinical committee assigned to each specialist group, and I think there's 25 different committees planned. The initial groups are diagnostic imaging, gastroenterology, nose and throat, obstetrics and thoracic medicine. And these groups were probably chosen first up because it's probably believed they can get some quick wins. So there's been a lot of discussion about the necessity for routine x-rays for low back pain and how the clinical evidence doesn't bear out that they're really necessary. So the first thing that happened was some very non-contentious obsolete items were to be deleted from the list. Oh, jumped ahead again. There we go. So there were three major take-homes from the interim report that from a devices point of view, I found very interesting. So While there was no firm recommendations at this stage, the report did contemplate quite a few interesting things. So the first one that piqued my interest, that contemplated recommending interim items to be included on the medical benefit schedule. Now this is, there's been a lot of lobbying from industry in the past to have temporary item numbers included on the medical benefit schedule so that procedures that look promising can be started to be used and paid for in the community and data gathered at the same time. However, it really hasn't happened in Australia, and the couple of times it has, it's not been very successful. We haven't really looked at collecting the data in a meaningful way. So that's a new way of doing, that's a new initiative that might be very worthwhile from an industry perspective if it's done well. The other thing is recommending new item numbers that might be rapidly assessed by MSAC. And for those who don't know, we'll discuss MSAC in a minute, but that's the Medical Services Advisory Committee that recommends new procedures to be included on the medical benefit schedule. Now, MSAC is really not known for its speed. It's an excruciatingly slow process. So a rapid assessment might not be all that rapid, but certainly that's of interest to sponsors bringing new technology into the country because it might be a quicker way to market. And the other thing I thought was really interesting is looking at including high-priced disposable items for out-of-hospital procedures in the fee. So currently this is a real issue if you're having an outpatient procedure that requires a high-cost disposable. So one that comes to mind would be catheters for working on varicose veins or something like that. Those items are quite expensive, and at the moment there's no way for them to be paid for under the MBS unless the patient pays for it themselves. So I think that looks, like a very useful thing to happen if it comes to fruition. So just the last few minutes, I want to talk about the Medical Services Advisory Committee, which is the body that, as I said before, assesses whether new procedures are cost-effective and clinically effective and a good value and should be subsidised by Medicare. So for those of us who've been involved in these processes, we realise that an application to MSAC is not to be undertaken lightly. It's a huge use of resources and time. It requires a major submission, including a full assessment of the evidence, an economic evaluation, a budget impact analysis, and it generally takes at a minimum 2 years. So this process has been reformed recently, and the reforms are all about the process rather than the outcome. And while the documentation of the reforms is hugely bureaucratic and it's sometimes almost incomprehensible to read, after you get through it all, there are actually some really good options for applicants. Oops, keep doing that. So the initial application is far more complex and more resource intensive, and you have to have the support of the clinical craft group right from the outset. So right at the beginning, the department verifies the availability of evidence for assessment. While we don't quite know what that means, it seems like it's a quick and dirty assessment to just see that you have enough evidence to go through. The good thing about this allows for a fast no if your evidence base isn't really not there before committing more resources. The second bit is a weird name called PICO confirmation. It's a very clumsy name, but essentially what it is, it's an outline of the PICO formula, Population Intervention Comparator Outcome. So the PICO confirmation is a document that outlines the main clinical and economic questions that must be addressed in the main submission. So this is important. This outlines the basis for your economic evaluation. What's interesting about this is that a contracted HTA group and not the applicant prepares this, which does give me some concern because in the past this has not been done well by HTA groups. There's been some misunderstanding of the technologies, but there is consultation built into the process, so it may be better this time round. We're yet to see how it's going to pan out because it's so new. And finally, this is what I think will be really useful for people. There's now an option to submit clinical evidence before preparing and submitting the economic model. While this will add additional steps in the process, I think it'll be good because it'll give the applicant an indication of what evidence to rely upon when building the economic model. So if MSAC deems that the evidence is insufficient or there's too many uncertainties, then you can stop the application at that point without incurring the time and expense to build an economic model, which is the biggest part of the application. So while it might be more lengthy to begin with, I think it'll be more efficient in the long run for lots of applicants. And so just last slide, just want to look at some trends of what we've been seeing from MSAC decisions. So there's increasing rigour around the indication. So MSAC wants to consistently narrow down the appropriate indication for an intervention. Therefore, the indication in the item numbers is getting more and more specific. And generally, there seems to be very little tolerance for uncertainty in clinical trials. So while that's all very understandable, it's very difficult for clinical areas that have difficulty conducting randomised controlled trials, and the example that comes to mind immediately is radiotherapy, because new radiotherapy modalities regularly get rejected by MSAC. It's only the very occasional one that gets through. So I'm finished. That was a very quick assessment of all the trends, and I'm going to hand over to my lovely colleague George, and he can get going.
Afternoon and good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us. So we're going to switch modes a little bit and talk about the pharmaceutical side of the reimbursement landscape in Australia. You can see on the slide I've got updates from November 2015, which was the last time Sarah and I were talking to everyone. So we're going to try and do them a little more often than we have been in the past. You'll see there's 5 topics that I've chosen to discuss on this webinar. So I think the main one is the PBAC guidelines, which have been under review to be updated. That will be first. Secondly, a short description of price disclosure and what's been happening and why. Then an interesting development in the last month, where the Department of Health has released some interesting data that becomes available publicly. So that's the public release of linkable 10% Medicare data. Then we'll move to the life-saving drug program, which is really a recap from last year and an update, and it actually hasn't moved very quickly. And then finally, to finish off, we'll touch on the review of the pharmacy remuneration and regulation review, which was part of the government's commitment as part of the 6th Community Pharmacy Agreement. So let's move to the Pharmaceutical Benefits Advisory Committee, the guidelines review. So again, just a recap of what are the guidelines. It's actually version 4.5 at the moment, which is July 2015, not 4.4. But for those not familiar, it's essentially a blueprint or a guideline on how to prepare the submission to list a new medicine or medicinal product on the Pharmaceutical Benefits Scheme. And it provides quite a detailed set of instructions that is information that the PBAC would like to see, and its subcommittee, the Economic Subcommittee and Drug Utilisation Subcommittee. So it essentially suggests the most appropriate form for clinical evidence and economic evaluation evidence. So why review the guidelines? Well, essentially, you can see the timeline on the page. The last major revision of the guidelines, where we went from, say, version 3 to version 4, was in 2006. All the iterations since then, version 4.3, 4.4, 4.5, have been what we would call minor revisions or minor updates. So essentially, it has been 10 years since the guidelines have been looked at in any particular detail or critically. So the three main reasons that the government is looking at is try to keep the process consistent and transparent, and as the methodological issues have evolved over time, and there's also the opportunity for refinement of the guidelines. Things have crept in that may not be appropriate or have been superseded. So the current review will be a major upgrade, so it'll be version 5.0. When the guideline review was announced, there were essentially four main buckets or main areas in the terms of reference, and I won't read through all the detail there, but the four main areas were an update of the technical methodology that's used and raised by the PBSE and the stakeholders, method guidance, and also the appendices. There's been quite a lot of appendices that have crept in, and there needs to be some harmonisation of that. International comparison. The Australian Department and the government wants to ensure that the guidelines do contain and are relevant from an international perspective and incorporate the methodologies that are currently being developed. And then lastly, there's a governance bucket that there was the establishment of the Guidelines Review Steering Committee, or GRSC, as you'll see the acronym later on, and also that consists of Australian and international experts. They've met a number of times so we can ensure the guidelines, the eventual ones, the version 5, remain relevant and continue to also reflect international best practice. And you'll see on the slides, which we will be sending out to all the participants later, there are links at the bottom, and you can link to the actual detail of each reference that we're talking about. So what about the guidelines review, the timeline? It's been a somewhat rapid review, considering how many reviews have been going on in the government and the department. And you'll see the life-saving drugs program later on that has been going on for quite some while. But essentially, I think the main thing at the moment is the request for tender was April last year, so just over a year ago. And we've moved quite rapidly through to public submissions and reviews. The Adelaide Health Technology Group was awarded the tender to help with the position papers and rewriting the guidelines. And where we are now, as we move between August and November of this year, the guidelines are anticipated to be released, or the final draft for comment, around November. There will be some training and educational series about the new guidelines and what's changed and what hasn't. And while there hasn't been an absolute timeline for implementation, one would assume that they will be implemented on a rolling basis during 2017 to coincide with the PBAC meetings and the submission deadlines in March, July and November next year. So who's involved? As I mentioned before, the Guidelines Review Steering Committee, as I made up of various people, but you can see it was quite a broad stakeholder engagement. So the members of the PBAC, Economic Subcommittee, Drug Utilisation Subcommittee, the Department of Health, Medicines Australia, for people overseas, it's the industry representative group like Pharma and ABPI in the UK, and then also local and international academics. As I mentioned, the Adelaide Health Technology Assessment Team at the University of Adelaide were contracted to pull it all together, harmonise it, write some technical papers, and Biotext is the medical writing company involved. So the next two slides, we're going to talk about what seem to be the key changes likely in version 5.0. So there will be one thing that I haven't quite mentioned there, but you'll see references to sections 1, 2, 3 and 4, which essentially are renaming or rebranding of currently the sections A through F. So there'll be an additional disease overview area in section 1. There's a lot of additional advice around the main comparator. It's probably the most contentious issue in the guidelines at the moment, so everyone's waiting to see what the final guidance will be, but essentially the choice of the comparator, future comparators and the definition thereof will remain one of the key updates and changes. the guidelines will be adopting the PICO structure, which sort of brings it more in line with the MBS and the MSAC process, which Sarah spoke about before. There'll be an acknowledgement of potential usefulness of non-traditional methodologies under certain circumstances, like Bayesian analyses or probabilistic sensitivity analyses. And then Section C essentially is evaporated into two separate areas. So the area of applicability will go into Section 2, and translational issues are incorporated into Section 3. And there will also be updated financial spreadsheets specific to Section 4. And then the second part of the changes slide, there'll be some in Appendix 8, there'll be more information about patient preference and non-healthcare costs and societal costs, and they'll be acknowledged, how to be incorporated or where. In terms of discounting, there'll be more sensitivities called for, and there'll be also a willingness possibly to consider alternatives in terms of the discounting. And the manual of resources will be updated, which has been sorely and long overdue. I think everyone's looking forward to that. And then there will also be a process document. So what happens prior to the PBAC submission process, during and post. So it becomes a little bit clearer. And there will be two sections which are, some people may consider non-pharmaceutical, but the vaccines section will be updated, of how the PBAC expects to see or wishes to see submissions. And there's a separate work stream for codependent technologies, and that section will also be updated. And by codependency, we mean technologies that rely on each other for appropriate use, such as a drug and a diagnostic, for argument's sake. So they're called codependent technologies. So I think the conclusion from the guidelines review is, I think it's been long overdue, and I think it's going to be a good addition to the working stream in Australia. But as has been mentioned by both departmental staff and PBAC members, the guidelines do remain just that, guidelines, so there is room to manoeuvre. So it has been a large undertaking by all the stakeholders, and there's been a lot of inclusion, a lot of discussions and submissions put forward. And I do think that the version 5.8 guidelines will be vastly improved, and it will be quite a modern, up-to-date HTA document that I think should provide everyone involved in the process with greater insight into what the PBAC is looking for when it comes to the submissions. So let's move on from the PBAC guidelines and the review to sort of the second topic, and the rest of the talk will go relatively quickly. So in terms of price disclosure, there's been some key changes since the 2015 Access and Sustainability Package or legislation. Again, I won't dwell on it, it'll be here for your reference, but there's three main buckets. So there was the issues of flow-on reductions for the F2, and that's formulary 2, combination items. No reduction in items who had a low volume and low discount, and there's a definition around what that meant. And also the removal of the originator brand data from the calculations under certain circumstances. So that were major changes as we move forward. So there were two price cycles, April and October, when the new prices come out. So the latest one has just been confirmed and announced for October 2016, and it's actually the first time where the cycle has removed the originator. And if you take a quick look at the numbers and the data that's provided by the department, you can still see that there are quite large price increases still being calculated and taken by manufacturers and pharmaceuticals. So for efficient funding of drugs, chemotherapy, you'll see in the current cycle that drugs have taken anywhere from 28 to 80% price decreases. And for the list of drugs that exclude the EFC drugs, the prices are still less, but still quite substantial, anywhere from 10 to 58% decreases in their ex-factory price. Another new policy from that sustainability package was a new statutory price decrease in addition to the ones that already exist. And in summary, essentially it means for the branded drugs, which are the ones on the F1 formulary, essentially that will apply a one-off 5% price reduction for drugs that have at least been on the PBS for 5 years. So new brands, new indications, and new pharmaceutical items, however, don't generate a separate 5-year period. So this essentially came into effect for the first time on the 1st of April this year. Kind of appealed to my sense of humour that it was April Fool's Day. I'm not sure that was an intentional way to do it, but I did chuckle at that. And anyway, so over the next essentially 4 years, up until the 1st of April 2020, drugs that meet that criteria just previously mentioned will have that 5% applied. The thing you have to recall that, be aware of there is, as you prepare PBAC submissions, is to take into account that the future 5% price decrease that may happen during your evaluation period or during your modelling, which the department will catch you up on if you don't take that into account. Okay, another interesting area has been the relatively difficult way of accessing data from the department. So I thought somewhat surprisingly on 1st of August this year, the Department of Health decided to publicly release the 10% sample of Medicare data. And what that means is it's actually Medicare MBS data and pharmaceutical benefits scheme data, so drug and services data, and being able to link it. So there's essentially 1 billion lines of de-identified historical data. From MBS, it's from 1984 to 2014, and from PBS, it's from 2003 to 2014. You can see the website at the bottom. It's the government's data website. So it will, as I mentioned, it includes release of services provided to Australians by doctors, the pathologist, diagnostics, that's the MBS data, and the individual PBS claims data. Now, you have to recall it's a random 10% sample, but for people who work in this area, it's quite exciting to be able to have that publicly available for everybody and also have it linked. So it's going to be quite interesting to see how people incorporate it, utilise it, and take care of utilise it, into their submissions or other, even public health research. So the last one I'll touch on as we hurtle towards the end of this presentation is the Life Savings Drugs Program, which we sort of talked about at our last update. So just a quick background, as you recall, or for people who were on the call, the Life Savings Drugs Program, it's a specific program that provides subsidised access for eligible patients for expensive life-saving drugs for often very rare life-threatening conditions. So currently we have 10 medicines for the treatment of 7 conditions. I think there may be one more actually, so which I haven't included, but you can see the list of drugs there and what type they are. The terms of reference of the Life Saving Drugs Program, you can see on the next slide there. Essentially, the department or the government wanted to basically conduct an international comparison of how these drugs for rare diseases or even ultra rare are paid for, how they're defined, and also compare the subsidies between the PBS and the LSDP, because they kind of sit in different funding buckets and other issues of access of equity, value for money, and so forth. And then the other main issue was, because of rare diseases, the collection of information, clinical trials, how is this done or can be better done to assist with that value-making process. There's been quite a few interested parties, over 31 submissions from the various consumer groups and industry groups and so forth. However, the issue remains that even though the review was announced back in 2014 and was expected to be completed early 2016, we haven't seen any any outcome, any resolution or anything of that at the moment. So that's still ongoing. So unfortunately, I just left it on. That's in, we're monitoring it, and we're going to stay tuned and see where that takes us. So hopefully, when Sarah and I come back sooner than a year, we'll be able to update you on that. And so that brings us to the close of our presentation. So I wanted to just say thank you on behalf of, oh, I apologise. I had one more, but sorry. I did put my fifth one in, which I'll say very quickly. It was the review of the pharmacy remuneration and regulations. This was negotiations as part of the pharmacy agreement to look at three main things: future remuneration of the pharmacy space, pharmacy location rules, and then how products are dispensed, paid for through the wholesaling and the supply mechanism. The main issue here is that this review has actually gone, I'll just skip over the regulations. There's a lot of detail on those 5 areas that I just spoke about: the wholesaling regulation, accountability regulation, and the consumers, which I'm going to just skip through so we can stick to time. But the main thing is that this review has been quite, I think, well handled. Great review. The 3 main review panel you can see there, they've done from December of last year. They will deliver their final report in 2017 of March, and everyone's eagerly awaiting it, especially from the reimbursement side, how supply markups and pharmacy location laws may or may not change. And we're waiting for the interim report in late 2016. The one thing that this group has done extremely well has been the extensive feedback and consultations. Over 90 site visits, 900 people have attended 15 public forums. They had a national live webcast, which I listened to last week. It was very well done, very informative. And you still have an opportunity to provide a written submission, which closes on the 23rd of September, or an online survey, and you can see the link there, by the 30th of September if you want to put your voice in there. So as we hurtle towards the end of our allotted 40 minutes, we've come to the end of the webinar. So we want to thank you for your participation and questions. And we'll probably, we can open it up to chats, questions. If you have any, you'll have to use the message or the chat forum on our web phone. And I think we've got one coming in from Sarah.
Yeah, so I've got a question here from Donna, and she's wondering how what I think might happen to the price of prostheses with this new committee and the new drive to increase the affordability and accessibility quote. Look, I think what will happen is there is a big political drive to decrease the prices of some headline devices, and politically I think the Minister wants to have a couple of wins. So it's highly likely, I think, the hip replacements, knee replacements, and some of the high-cost cardiac devices, which are the ones that have been receiving all the publicity, will have to eat a price decrease. I think across the great range of items that are included on the prostheses list, it's not as obvious that there's price discrepancies, and I think this will be done a little bit more judiciously. But it all depends what sort of process that the committee comes up with, and you know, that's just a complete unknown at the moment. So it'll probably happen quite quickly, I think. Okay, well, you all must be very well informed. We haven't got any other questions, so let's just want to say thank you. Look, George and I, we're always prepared to give anyone 20 minutes of our time. If you have a question or you want to have a discussion, our contact details are there. And thank you very, very much for joining.
Thank you very much. Goodbye, everyone.